1714, England controlled a handful of colonies and a battered treasury. By 1837, it commanded the largest empire the world had ever seen, produced more manufactured goods than the rest of Europe combined, and had doubled its own population in barely 4 generations. The speed of that transformation has no equal in human history. But behind the grand numbers is a stranger and more human story. 100 years of ordinary people, farmers and factory workers, duchesses and debtors navigating a world that was reinventing itself faster than anyone could understand. How did a nation remake itself so completely, and at what cost to the men and women who lived through it? In this documentary, we uncover the full, unvarnished story of Georgian England, from the crowning of a German king who could barely speak English to the dawn of the Victorian age that would inherit his empire. It was the first day of August, 1714, and a queen lay dying in Kensington Palace. Anne Stuart, last of her royal line, breathed her final breath without a single surviving heir. 12 children she had borne, and not one had outlived her. With her death, an era closed, and Britain faced a question that would define the next century. Who would rule? The answer had already been written into law 14 years earlier. The Act of Settlement of 1700 had done something remarkable, something that still echoes in British constitutional life today. It had looked past dozens of Catholic claimants with stronger blood ties to the throne and reached across the sea to a Protestant German house, the Hanoverians. The act was blunt in its purpose. A Catholic monarch was unthinkable to the Protestant establishment that had fought so hard and shed so much blood to secure its religious settlement. Faith, not blood, would determine the crown. And so, in the late summer of 1714, 54-year-old Georg Ludwig, Elector of Hanover, made the slow journey northward from his continental home to claim a kingdom he had never visited, whose language he barely spoke, and whose people regarded him with a mixture of duty, curiosity, and quiet suspicion. What did Britain make of this man? He arrived in Greenwich on the 18th of September, stepping onto English soil for the very first time as its king. George I was not without qualities. He was experienced in governance, having ruled Hanover capably for over a decade. He was shrewd. He was stubborn. But he was undeniably foreign, conducting court business in French and Latin because his English was so limited, preferring his Hanoverian advisors and his Hanoverian habits. He brought with him 2 mistresses, promptly nicknamed by the London wits as the Maypole and the Elephant for their contrasting figures. Britain, never short of an opinion, had already begun to assess its new monarch and find him wanting in warmth. Yet the real drama of these opening years was not in the palace. It was in Parliament. The political landscape of 1714 was a battlefield between 2 great factions. The Tories, many of whom nursed quiet sympathies for the exiled Stuart claimant James Francis Edward, known to his opponents as the Old Pretender, found themselves on the losing side of history. The Whigs, champions of the Protestant succession and the commercial classes, were triumphant. They had backed the right dynasty, and now they intended to collect their reward. George, for his part, rewarded the Whigs lavishly and froze the Tories out of power with a cold efficiency. The result was a Whig political dominance that would stretch, with few interruptions, for generations. It was in these early years that the foundations were laid for something transformative. With a king who had little interest in the daily mechanics of English governance, power began quietly, almost invisibly, to migrate toward ministers, toward Parliament, toward what would, in time, become the cabinet system of government that modern democracies around the world still echo today. Britain in 1714 was a nation of roughly 6 million souls, a patchwork of farming villages and emerging towns, its empire still modest compared to what it would become. Few standing in the crowds that watched George I process through London streets could have imagined what the next 100 years would bring. Revolution in America. Revolution in France. Wars that would span entire oceans. An industrial transformation that would remake the very earth beneath their feet. But all of that lay ahead. For now, a German king sat on an English throne, and a century of upheaval had quietly begun. The ink had barely dried on George I's claim to the throne when the challenge came. Within a year of the Hanoverian succession, broadswords were being sharpened in the Scottish Highlands, and the question that many had hoped was settled by law would now be put to the test of open battle. The Rising of 1715 was a serious affair, far more dangerous than history often remembers it. John Erskine, the Earl of Mar, raised the Jacobite standard at Braemar in September of that year, gathering an army of some 12,000 men under the banner of James Francis Edward Stuart, the Old Pretender. For a brief and volatile moment, the Hanoverian dynasty looked genuinely fragile. The north of England stirred. Scotland seethed head. Catholic sympathizers across Europe watched with interest. But the rising collapsed almost as quickly as it had gathered. Mar proved to be a general of spectacular indecision, hesitating at precisely the moments when boldness might have changed everything. The Battle of Sheriffmuir in November of 1715 ended in a bloody stalemate, and when the Old Pretender himself finally landed on Scottish soil in December, he brought neither the French troops nor the inspiring presence his supporters had been promised. He was melancholy, cold, and visibly unprepared for the role of romantic savior. By February of 1716, he had slipped back across the sea, and the Rising was over. The dream, however, was not. For the next 3 decades, Jacobitism smoldered beneath the surface of British life, less a military threat than a cultural and emotional loyalty. In Highland glens and Irish drawing rooms, in the toasts raised over glasses passed symbolically above bowls of water, the faithful drank to the king over the water. It was dangerous sentiment, and it shaped how governments in London viewed Scotland with a persistent grinding suspicion. Then came 1745, and with it a figure who would burn himself into legend. Charles Edward Stuart, grandson of the exiled James II, was 24 years old, strikingly handsome, and possessed of a charisma his father entirely lacked. Bonnie Prince Charlie landed on the Scottish coast in July with barely 7 companions and an audacity that stunned observers on both sides. Within weeks, the Highland clans rallied. Edinburgh fell. A government army was routed at Prestonpans in minutes. The Jacobite advance into England reached as far south as Derby, sending genuine panic through London streets. Then, inexplicably, the retreat began. French reinforcements never came. English Jacobites stayed indoors. The army turned north again, pursued and exhausted. The end came on a bleak moorland northeast of Inverness. At Culloden, on the 16th of April, 1746, the Jacobite cause was destroyed in less than an hour. The Highland charge, devastating on other fields, broke against disciplined musket fire and grapeshot. Somewhere between 1,000 and 2,000 Jacobites died that day. The Duke of Cumberland, commanding the government forces, earned the name Butcher for what followed. Wounded men were killed where they lay. The reprisals spread across the Highlands for months. What came after Culloden was nothing less than a cultural dismemberment. The wearing of Highland dress was banned. The carrying of arms was forbidden. The clan system, which had organized Highland life for centuries, was systematically broken apart. A people and a way of life were not merely defeated but deliberately unmade by parliamentary statute. The shadow of the Jacobites had finally lifted, but it left behind a Scotland transformed and a British state more conscious than ever of the tensions binding its composite nations together. Those tensions, however imperfectly managed, would demand new answers as the century wore on, and as the empire these islands were building began to take on a shape no one had quite anticipated. While Highland Scotland was still smoking from Cumberland's reprisals, something equally consequential had already been reshaping England's political landscape for more than 2 decades. The story of Georgian stability is inseparable from one man, a broad, jovial, deeply calculating Norfolk squire named Sir Robert Walpole. To understand Walpole's rise, one must first understand the catastrophe that made it possible. In 1720, Britain experienced its first great financial disaster of the modern age. The South Sea Company, granted a monopoly on trade with Spanish America, had promised investors extraordinary returns. Speculators from duchesses to shopkeepers poured their savings in, watching share prices climb from roughly £100 to nearly £1,000 in the space of months. Then the bubble burst. Fortunes accumulated over generations vanished in weeks. Suicides followed. Outrage swept Parliament. The entire political class stood accused of corruption, incompetence, or both. Into this wreckage stepped Walpole. He had the considerable advantage of having sold his own South Sea shares before the collapse, which protected his reputation while nearly everyone around him was ruined. More importantly, he possessed something rarer than luck, an extraordinary talent for managing both money and men. He restructured the national debt, restored confidence in the financial system, and quietly shielded enough powerful figures from scandal to build himself an unassailable network of obligation and gratitude. By 1721, he was First Lord of the Treasury and Chancellor of the Exchequer simultaneously, positions he would hold for an astonishing 21 years. No one had done this before. No one would do it quite the same way again. What Walpole built was something entirely new in British governance. The cabinet, previously a loose gathering of royal advisors, became under his hand a coherent executive body that answered to him rather than directly to the king. He cultivated his relationship with Queen Caroline, wife of George II, with practiced skill, knowing she held genuine influence over her husband. Patronage flowed outward from his office like water from a spring, rewarding loyalty and punishing independence. His critics called it corruption. Walpole called it governing. His guiding principle was deceptively simple. Peace abroad meant prosperity at home. While other European powers exhausted themselves in continental wars, Britain's merchant fleet expanded. Trade with the colonies deepened. The middling classes, those ambitious tradesmen and manufacturers whose fortunes were tied to stable credit and open ports, flourished under conditions Walpole deliberately maintained. He finally fell in 1742, brought down by a war with Spain he had tried and failed to prevent, his political enemies having spent years maneuvering against him. But the structures he had built, cabinet government, parliamentary management, the primacy of commerce as national policy, survived him entirely. Walpole had not merely governed Georgian England. He had given it the scaffolding upon which everything that followed would be constructed, including the extraordinary explosion of industry and ambition waiting just beyond the horizon. Step outside the corridors of Westminster, away from Walpole's careful calculations and parliamentary maneuvers, and something overwhelming awaits. A roar. A stench. A city unlike anything else on earth. By the 1720s, London held more than 600,000 souls within its boundaries, making it the largest city in the Western world. 1 in 10 English men and women lived here, packed into a sprawling, chaotic, magnificent mass of streets that stretched from the docks of Wapping westward to the new terraces rising at Mayfair. No map could quite capture it. No visitor could quite believe it. What struck arrivals first was the noise. The iron-rimmed wheels of carts grinding over cobblestones. Street sellers crying their wares from dawn until dark, offering everything from hot pies to lavender water. Church bells marking the hours across 100 parishes. And beneath it all, the low, constant murmur of a city in perpetual motion, buying, selling, arguing, praying, scheming. The Thames was London's lifeblood, its great artery connecting the capital to the world. On any given morning, more than 1,000 vessels might crowd its surface simultaneously. Colliers from Newcastle carrying coal, merchantmen arriving heavy with sugar and tobacco from the Atlantic colonies, lighters ferrying goods from ship to shore. The custom house on the North Bank processed duties on wealth pouring in from every corner of the known globe. London was not merely a city of commerce. It was the commercial center of an expanding empire, and the river made it so. Yet London was also a city of violent contradictions. Head westward toward the new developments rising north of James's Park, and the contrast was almost painful in its clarity. Here, property developers and aristocratic landowners were laying out streets of breathtaking elegance. Grosvenor Square, completed in the 1730s, covered 6 acres of formal geometry. Hanover Square, Berkeley Square, and dozens of smaller developments offered townhouses of warm brick and white stone, their facades disciplined and harmonious, their interiors furnished with walnut and mahogany. This was Georgian architecture in its purest expression, rational, ordered, confident. It was a built declaration that wealth and taste had found their proper home. Walk east or north, however, and the city revealed its other face entirely. In the parishes of St. Giles, Southwark, and Whitechapel, streets narrowed to alleys barely wide enough for 2 people to pass. Families of 6 or 8 shared single rooms. Drainage was a fantasy. Infant mortality ran at catastrophic rates, with perhaps half of all children born in these districts failing to reach their 5th birthday. Disease moved through the overcrowded tenements with terrible efficiency. And then there was gin. Cheap Dutch gin had flooded the London market in the early decades of the century, available at thousands of unlicensed premises for a fraction of the price of beer. William Hogarth captured the horror in his engraving of 1751, Gin Lane, showing a street of ruin and dissolution, mothers oblivious to their children, bodies left unburied, an entire neighborhood consumed. It was not pure fantasy. In the 1730s, Londoners were consuming perhaps 11 million gallons of gin per year. Parliament eventually moved against it with the Gin Acts, but the problem resisted easy solutions for decades. London was also the nation's legal and financial heart. The Inns of Court trained the lawyers who argued before Westminster Hall. The Bank of England, established just before the Georgian era began, anchored a financial system that was becoming the envy of Europe. Lloyd's Coffee House had evolved into the world's preeminent insurance market. Jonathan's Coffee House in Exchange Alley was transforming, trade by trade, into what would eventually become the London Stock Exchange. Here, then, was the essential Georgian paradox made physical. The same city that produced Grosvenor Square also produced Gin Lane. The same river that carried imperial wealth also carried the bodies of those who had fallen through the cracks of a society moving faster than any institution could manage. Understanding this city, its energy, and its cruelty is essential to understanding everything that Georgian England was about to become. Step away from London's roaring streets, its gin-soaked alleys and gleaming Georgian terraces, and another England comes into focus. A quieter England. One measured not in coffeehouse transactions or parliamentary divisions, but in the turning of seasons, the ringing of church bells on a Sunday morning, and the slow rhythm of plow and furrow. In the early decades of the Georgian era, roughly 8 out of every 10 English men and women lived not in cities but in the countryside. Their world was the parish, a unit of life so fundamental it governed almost everything. The parish church stood at its center, literally and spiritually. The vicar recorded births, marriages, and deaths. The churchwardens administered poor relief. The vestry meeting decided local taxation. For most rural people, the parish was not merely where they worshipped. It was the entire architecture of their existence. Above the village, in the great house set back behind iron gates and ornamental grounds, lived the squire. His authority was real and largely uncontested. As local magistrate, he settled disputes, punished petty crimes, and decided who received charity and who did not. The relationship between squire and tenant was ancient and unwritten, built on deference from below and a degree of paternalistic obligation from above. It was not always comfortable. It was rarely equal, but it held. The fields surrounding most English villages in this period were still organized along medieval lines. Under the open field system, arable land was divided into long, narrow strips distributed among tenant farmers across 2 or 3 large common fields. A family might hold dozens of strips scattered across the parish, farming them in rotation, leaving one field fallow each year to recover its strength. Beyond the arable lay the common, rough pasture where villagers exercised ancient rights to graze a cow or a few geese, cut turf for fuel, or gather wood. These common rights were not merely traditional. For the poorest families, they were the difference between subsistence and destitution. The agricultural laborer's life was governed by physical demand that modern imagination struggles to comprehend. Ploughing in February cold with heavy clay soil resisting every step. Weeding through June heat under a sun that offered no mercy. Then the urgent, anxious weeks of harvest in late July and August, when every able body in the village bent to the work, because a single week of rain could ruin a year's hope. Wages were low and irregular, supplemented wherever possible by gleaning rights that allowed the poor to gather grain left behind after the main harvest had passed. Yet rural life was not unrelieved toil. The calendar offered punctuation. Harvest home, when the last wagon of grain came in decorated with ribbons and the farmer provided a feast for his workers, was one of the great communal moments of the year. Village fairs brought peddlers, traveling entertainers, and livestock traders to the local market town each spring and autumn. Wakes Weeks, the annual festival tied to the parish's patron saint, meant dancing, wrestling, and temporary suspension of ordinary discipline. These were not trivial diversions. They were the social glue of communities that had little else to hold them together. What strikes any observer looking closely at this rural world is how stable and how fragile it actually was. The open fields, the common rights, the seasonal traditions, and the parish structures had endured for generations. They felt permanent precisely because they were so deeply woven into daily life. But forces were already gathering that would tear much of this world apart. Parliamentary enclosure was beginning its slow advance across the English countryside, and the men with the power to reshape the landscape were growing impatient with the ancient, inefficient ways of the parish and the plough. What did it mean to belong to Georgian England? The answer depended entirely on where you stood in one of the most rigidly stratified societies in European history. And yet, paradoxically, it was also a society quietly remaking itself from within. At the very summit stood the aristocracy, perhaps 400 families whose names echoed through centuries of English life. Dukes, earls, and marquises presided over estates of tens of thousands of acres, their income flowing from tenant rents, mineral rights, and shrewd marriages arranged across generations. Their country houses were not merely homes, but statements of power made permanent in stone. Blenheim Palace, built for the Duke of Marlborough, covered roughly 7 acres under its roof alone. Chatsworth, Houghton, Stowe, these were landscapes sculpted to announce dominion over nature itself. The aristocracy sat in the House of Lords by birthright, controlled dozens of parliamentary seats through pocket boroughs, and regarded political authority as simply another hereditary possession. Below them, but sharing many of their aspirations, stood the gentry, perhaps 20,000 families who held land without noble title. They hunted, they served as justices of the peace, they sent sons into the church and the army. Their world was the one explored in the novels of Jane Austen, where questions of income, inheritance, and connection governed every drawing room conversation with barely concealed urgency. Yet Georgian England was not merely a drama played out between lords and laborers. Filling the expanding space between them came a group contemporaries called the middling sort, and their rise would prove one of the era's most consequential developments. Merchants, attorneys, physicians, manufacturers, and clergy with comfortable livings formed this growing class, perhaps 1 in 5 of the population by the later Georgian decades. They inhabited the new terraced townhouses of Bath and Bristol, dressed carefully in good wool, educated their children with deliberate ambition, and consumed the novels, magazines, and pianofortes that a flourishing commercial economy now made available to those with modest but reliable incomes. Aspiration was the engine of middling life. A successful attorney might educate his son at one of the inns of court, marry his daughter to a clergyman, and retire to a small country estate, arriving within a single generation at the fringes of gentry respectability. The boundaries were permeable enough to encourage hope. They were firm enough to make the journey feel meaningful. Binding all these households together, from aristocratic palace to middling townhouse, was the vast institution of domestic service. It was, quite simply, the largest single employer in Georgian England. Footmen in powdered wigs, ladies' maids, cooks, scullery girls, coachmen and grooms. At the peak of Georgian prosperity, one household in every 4 or 5 in London employed at least one servant. For young women migrating from rural parishes to find work, service offered a structured, if demanding, path. For the aristocracy, the number of servants kept was itself a measure of status. an advertisement of wealth rendered in human bodies rather than brickwork. But what of those for whom ambition was an unaffordable luxury? The destitute occupied the lowest and most precarious position in Georgian society, and England's response to their existence was ancient, local, and deeply uneven. The Poor Laws, stretching back to the reign of Elizabeth I, placed responsibility for the poor squarely on the parish. Overseers of the poor collected a local rate and distributed outdoor relief, small cash payments or food to the elderly, the sick, and the desperate. Settlement laws determined who belonged to which parish, and those caught needing relief far from home faced removal by cart back to their place of legal settlement. For those unable to cope, the workhouse waited. By the mid-Georgian decades, thousands of these institutions operated across England, offering food and shelter in exchange for labor, and subjecting their inmates to a regime designed to make poverty feel suitably uncomfortable. Critics already questioned whether humiliation constituted genuine charity. But meaningful reform remained decades away. Georgian society, then, was not a static pyramid but a dynamic, sometimes anxious hierarchy in motion. The old order of land and title still commanded enormous power. But money, commerce, and ambition were carving new channels through it, channels that would eventually reshape the nation entirely. Food and drink have always told a society's secrets. In Georgian England, they told a story of staggering inequality, moral panic, and an empire literally pouring its conquests into the cup. Nothing captured Georgian anxiety quite like gin. By the 1720s, London's poorest parishes had been transformed by the spirit, cheap to produce, cheaper to buy, and devastatingly potent. Gin shops multiplied on every corner, some advertising that a man could get drunk for a penny and dead drunk for twopence, with straw to sleep it off provided free of charge. William Hogarth captured it with brutal clarity in his 1751 print Gin Lane, where a mother, stupefied and oblivious, lets her infant tumble to its death. The image was propaganda, but it pointed at something real. Contemporary estimates suggested Londoners were consuming roughly 11 million gallons of gin annually by the 1740s. Parliament responded with a series of gin acts, imposing duties and licensing requirements, but early attempts collapsed under the weight of public resistance. Only the Act of 1751, combined with rising grain prices that made distilling more expensive, finally began to slow the flood. The poor who weren't drowning in gin were surviving on a diet that left little room for pleasure. Bread was the foundation of working-class life, a coarse, dark loaf made from wheat when prices allowed from rye, barley, or oats when they didn't. Porridge, potatoes in increasing quantities as the century wore on, and occasional scraps of salted meat or bacon rounded out the table. Fresh vegetables were seasonal luxuries. Protein was scarce. When harvests failed and bread prices rose, the consequences were immediate and desperate. Food riots, crowds seizing grain wagons or attacking millers accused of hoarding, were a recurring feature of Georgian life, a visible reminder of how little separated the laboring poor from outright hunger. Cross the threshold into a prosperous household, and the world transformed entirely. Wealthy Georgians ate with extraordinary ambition, serving multi-course meals that might begin with soup, progress through fish, several meat dishes, and elaborate side dishes called removes, and conclude with pyramids of jellies, creams, and imported fruits. French cuisine was fashionable among those who could afford it, and a skilled cook was among the most valued servants in any great house. The coffeehouse had emerged in the previous century, but it remained central to Georgian public life, particularly for professional men conducting business, reading newspapers, and debating politics over strong, bitter cups. Yet it was tea that ultimately conquered the Georgian table. Once an expensive curiosity, its price fell through the century as East India Company trade expanded and smuggling networks flooded the market. By the 1780s, tea had crossed class boundaries entirely. Laboring women brewed it weak with a scraping of sugar. Wealthy ladies arranged elaborate rituals around its service. It was one of the first genuinely shared pleasures in a deeply divided society. What a nation drinks together says something hopeful about it. And that shared cup, thin or strong, would carry the Georgian world into the industrial century ahead. Where did the wealth that filled those Georgian tables and coffeehouse cups actually come from? The answer lay not in the green fields of England alone, but in the restless movement of ships across 3 oceans, carrying cargo that would make some men fabulously rich and condemn others to unimaginable suffering. By the 1720s, England had positioned itself at the center of a vast commercial web. The so-called triangular trade was its most profitable and most brutal expression. Ships departed Bristol and Liverpool laden with manufactured goods, copper, guns, and textiles, bound for the West African coast. There, those goods were exchanged for enslaved African men, women, and children, who were then transported across the Atlantic in the notorious Middle Passage, packed into vessels designed for profit rather than human survival. Mortality rates among the enslaved on these crossings could reach 20% or higher. The survivors were sold in the Caribbean and American colonies, and the ships returned to English ports carrying sugar, tobacco, and rum. The profits from each leg of the journey compounded into fortunes that reshaped entire cities. Bristol was transformed first. By the 1730s, it ranked as England's second city, its quaysides crowded with merchant vessels and its prosperous streets lined with townhouses built on Atlantic commerce. Bristol merchants financed roughly 2,000 slaving voyages over the course of the trade. Liverpool surpassed it as the century progressed, becoming by the 1780s the single largest slaving port in the world. 1 in every 8 Liverpool residents had some financial connection to the trade. The grand civic buildings that still define these cities today were largely raised on this foundation. Yet England's commercial ambitions stretched far beyond the Atlantic. The East India Company, chartered back in 1600, had evolved by the Georgian era into something extraordinary, less a trading firm than a sovereign power. Following the Battle of Plassey in 1757, the company effectively controlled the Bengal region of India, collecting taxes, raising armies, and administering justice over millions of people. Silks, spices, cotton textiles, indigo, and above all tea flowed back to English shores. The company's enormous profits enriched shareholders and generated the tax revenues that financed English military power. Its returning officials, known derisively as nabobs, returned home with fortunes that allowed them to buy estates and parliamentary seats, embedding Eastern trade money deep into the fabric of English society. All this commerce demanded institutions to support it. London's financial district rose to meet that need. Lloyd's Coffee House on Lombard Street had become, by the early 18th century, the informal headquarters of marine insurance, where merchants and underwriters gathered to spread risk across the growing fleet of trading vessels. The Bank of England, founded in 1694, expanded its role through the Georgian decades, providing credit to government and stability to commerce. Private banking houses multiplied. By the 1780s, the infrastructure of modern finance, insurance, credit, and investment was firmly established in the city. The consequences of this commercial revolution rippled through every layer of Georgian society. Merchant families who might have sold cloth in a market town a generation earlier now tracked commodity prices from the Caribbean and argued over company dividends. Ports became cosmopolitan places, home to sailors, merchants, and trading communities from across the globe. But the wealth generated by this empire of commerce was also generating questions that would grow louder with each passing decade. What were the true costs of this prosperity? And who bore them? The answers were beginning to find voices that would shape the next great argument in Georgian England. Where did all that merchant wealth ultimately land? For England's ruling elite, the answer was stone, brick, and rolling parkland, spread across the shires and monuments to power and taste that still punctuate the English countryside today. The great country house building boom accelerated through the 1720s and beyond, driven by a fashionable obsession with classical antiquity. Architects like William Kent, and later, Robert Adam looked to ancient Rome and the Renaissance villas of Andrea Palladio for inspiration. The result was a parade of symmetrical stone facades, columned porticos, and domed entrance halls that announced their owners' wealth and learning simultaneously. Holcombe Hall in Norfolk, begun in 1722, stretched across the landscape as if daring anyone to question the status of the Coke family. Kedleston Hall in Derbyshire, completed by Adam in the 1760s, transformed an entire village, which was simply demolished and relocated to preserve the view from the main windows. Nothing illustrated aristocratic confidence quite so plainly. The landscape surrounding these houses was itself a canvas. The old formal gardens of the previous century, with their geometric parterres and rigid avenues, fell out of fashion. In their place came something that appeared entirely natural but was, in fact, the product of enormous calculation and expense. Lancelot Brown, nicknamed Capability Brown for his habit of telling clients their estates had great capabilities, reshaped over 170 parks between the 1750s and his death in 1783. He moved rivers, created lakes, planted thousands of trees, and sculpted gentle hills, all to achieve a studied illusion of untouched nature. Blenheim Palace received his treatment, as did Chatsworth, Longleat, and dozens of others. The irony was perfect. England's richest families spent fortunes making their land look as though no human hand had touched it. Yet these houses were far more than aesthetic statements. They were functioning centers of political gravity. A great lord entertaining during the summer months might host members of parliament, government ministers, and foreign diplomats across his dining tables. Decisions about elections, appointments, and legislation were made in libraries and on garden walks, away from the formal chambers of Westminster. Patronage flowed outward from these houses into every surrounding parish, binding tenants, clergy, and tradespeople into webs of obligation and loyalty. Supporting this world required an army of labor hidden almost entirely from aristocratic sight. A substantial country house might employ 50 to 100 servants, from the housekeeper and butler who managed the household, to kitchen maids who rose before dawn and rarely saw daylight. They lived in basement quarters and back corridors, moving through separate staircases, existing in carefully observed proximity to their employers while remaining socially invisible. Their work kept the whole magnificent machinery running. The country house, then, was Georgian England in miniature, beautiful, ordered, powerful, and built upon the invisible labor of those who made the comfort of others possible. It was a world that felt permanent. But beyond the parkland walls, forces were already gathering that would test its certainties severely. Beyond the parkland walls, in London's smoky coffee houses and candlelit meeting rooms, a different kind of power was being built. Not the power of land and title, but the power of ideas. Georgian England inherited from the previous century one of the most consequential minds in human history. Isaac Newton had died in 1727, but his shadow stretched across the entire Georgian age. His laws of motion and universal gravitation had done something extraordinary. They had suggested that the natural world operated according to fixed, discoverable rules and that human reason was capable of finding them. That single proposition lit a fuse beneath every assumption about authority, tradition, and knowledge that European civilization had accumulated for centuries. The institution best placed to carry Newton's torch was the Royal Society, founded originally in 1660 but transformed in the Georgian period into a genuine engine of scientific inquiry. Fellows corresponded across national borders, shared experiments, and argued over findings with an energy that treated knowledge as collaborative rather than secretive. The astronomer Edmund Halley had already predicted the return of the comet that would bear his name. Now a new generation pressed further, measuring the transit of Venus across the sun in 1769, mapping coastlines, classifying plants and animals returning from voyages that circled the globe. Where did these men talk when they were not in laboratories or lecture theaters? The answer, almost invariably, was the coffee house. London by the 1730s hosted over 500 of them, each one a republic of conversation where the price of entry was the penny paid at the door. A merchant might sit beside a pamphleteer, a physician beside a poet. News sheets circulated freely. Debate was the currency. Lloyd's of London began as Edward Lloyd's Coffee House, where merchants gathered to insure ships. The stock exchange grew from Jonathan's Coffee House in Exchange Alley. Ideas had addresses in Georgian London, and those addresses served coffee. It was in this atmosphere of restless inquiry that Samuel Johnson produced the work that would define him for posterity. Published in 1755 after 8 years of labor, his Dictionary of the English Language was not the first English dictionary, but it was the first to attempt comprehensive authority. Johnson worked largely alone, aided by 6 assistants in a garret on Fleet Street, reading through thousands of books and selecting quotations to illustrate the meaning and usage of over 40,000 words. The result was not simply a reference work. It was a monument to the belief that the English language deserved the same systematic attention that Newton had given to the heavens. Johnson himself was the living embodiment of what the age called the Republic of Letters, a community defined by learning rather than birth. The son of a Lichfield bookseller, he had no inherited wealth and no noble patron to ease his way. What he had was a mind of extraordinary power and a circle of friends gathered at the literary club he founded in 1764 that included the painter Joshua Reynolds, the politician Edmund Burke, and the historian Edward Gibbon. These men argued, published, and shaped public conversation with a confidence that belonged, previously, only to the well-born. That confidence was perhaps the Enlightenment's most radical gift to Georgian England. The suggestion that careful observation, honest argument, and organized inquiry could improve not only science but society itself. It was a short step from cataloging the natural world to questioning the social one. And in the decades ahead, that step would be taken. What did it mean to see yourself clearly in a society so obsessed with rank and reputation? In Georgian England, that question found its answers on canvas, on stage, and in the pleasure gardens that lit up the London night. No artist understood the age more pitilessly than William Hogarth. Born in 1797 to a schoolmaster who had once been imprisoned for debt, Hogarth carried a lifelong fury at pretension and injustice. He turned that fury into pictures. His series, A Rake's Progress, completed in 1735, followed a young man's descent from inherited wealth into madness and the Bethlehem Royal Hospital, better known as Bedlam. Marriage a la mode skewered the aristocratic practice of selling daughters to the highest bidder. These were not gentle observations. They were surgical. Hogarth sold his images as engravings, cheap enough for the middling sort to buy, ensuring his satire reached precisely the audience his subjects would have preferred to ignore. The world Hogarth mocked was the same world that patronized Joshua Reynolds and Thomas Gainsborough. Where Hogarth showed England as it was, Reynolds and Gainsborough showed England as it wished to be seen. Reynolds, the first president of the newly founded Royal Academy of Arts, established in 1768 under Royal Charter, brought a scholar's ambition to portraiture. He studied the old Italian masters and wrapped his sitters in classical illusion, elevating the merchant's wife and the general to the dignity of antiquity. Gainsborough cared less for learning and more for light. His portraits shimmered with silks and soft parkland air, capturing a tenderness that Reynolds often missed. The two men disliked each other. The tension between them produced some of the finest paintings the century would see. The Royal Academy itself was a landmark. For the first time, British art had an official institution, a public exhibition space, and a school for training painters, sculptors, and architects. Its annual summer exhibitions became social events as much as artistic ones, drawing thousands of visitors eager to see and to be seen. But culture in Georgian England was never confined to gilded galleries. The theater roared with life, and at its center stood David Garrick. Actor, manager, and reformer, Garrick transformed Drury Lane into the most celebrated stage in Europe, restoring Shakespeare's original texts after decades of clumsy adaptation. He performed with a naturalism that stunned audiences accustomed to formal declamation. When Garrick wept, the audience wept with him. Beyond the theater walls lay the pleasure gardens. Vauxhall and Ranelagh offered fireworks, music, lantern-lit walkways, and the electric possibility of social mixing. For a modest entrance fee, a shopkeeper might brush shoulders with a duchess. The gardens were democratic in their way, and slightly dangerous, which was rather the point. Georgian culture, in all its forms, held a mirror to the age. Sometimes flattering, sometimes merciless, always alive. That same restless energy was beginning to turn toward questions far larger than art or entertainment. While painters and playwrights were mapping the interior landscape of Georgian society, a far grander map was being redrawn across the entire surface of the globe. Between 1756 and 1763, Britain fought and won a war on 6 continents, and nothing would ever be quite the same again. The conflict that historians would later call the 7 Years' War began with a skirmish in the forests of North America and ignited into something the world had never witnessed before. A genuinely global struggle fought from the Ohio River Valley to the coast of West Africa to the paddy fields of Bengal. France, Austria, Russia, and their allies stood on one side, Britain and Prussia on the other. The stakes were nothing less than the shape of the modern world. What separated Britain from its rivals was one man's vision. William Pitt the Elder, appointed Secretary of State in 1756, understood something his predecessors had not. The decisive battles of this war would not be fought in the muddy fields of Europe. They would be fought at sea, in the forests of Canada, and on the plains of India. Pitt poured money and men into those distant theaters while subsidizing Prussia to bleed France's armies in Europe. It was a strategy of breathtaking ambition, and it worked. In the summer of 1759, a year the British would long celebrate as their year of victories, a young general named James Wolfe scaled the cliffs above the Saint Lawrence River under cover of darkness. At dawn on the 13th of September, 1759, his forces faced the French army of the Marquis de Montcalm on the Plains of Abraham outside Quebec. The battle lasted barely 15 minutes. Both commanders were mortally wounded. When the smoke cleared, French Canada's fate was sealed. Wolfe died knowing he had won. Within a year, Montreal had fallen, and Britain controlled the entire eastern half of North America. Half a world away, a former clerk named Robert Clive was engineering an equally astonishing transformation. After his famous victory at the Battle of Plassey in 1757, Clive had effectively made the British East India Company the dominant power in Bengal, the richest province on the subcontinent. The methods were brutal, involving manipulation, bribery, and outright military force. The results were decisive. India, which had once been a place where British merchants came humbly to trade, was becoming a place where Britain intended to rule. The Treaty of Paris, signed in February 1763, formalized what the battles had won. France surrendered Canada, Florida passed from Spain to Britain, and trading posts and territories across India consolidated British supremacy. In a single document, Britain had acquired the largest empire the world had yet seen. But empires are expensive things to build and even more expensive to keep. The national debt had roughly doubled during the war, reaching nearly £140 million by 1763. Someone had to pay. Parliament's answer would be to look toward the American colonies, those prosperous settlements that had benefited so greatly from French removal. The colonists had a different opinion on the matter entirely. The very victories that made Britain the world's supreme power had planted the seeds of a crisis that would, within a generation, tear away the most valuable part of what had just been won. The empire ascendant was also, without knowing it, the empire on the edge of fracture. The question had been building for years, simmering beneath the surface of an empire flush with victory. Who bore the cost of empire? Parliament's answer, delivered in 1765 through the Stamp Act, was unambiguous. The American colonists would. For the first time, London was imposing a direct tax on the colonies, requiring stamps on everything from legal documents to playing cards to newspapers. The revenue would help offset the enormous debt accumulated in their defense. The colonists' response stunned London. Riots broke out from Boston to Charleston. The cry of no taxation without representation echoed across the Atlantic and landed in Parliament like a stone through glass. English merchants, flooded with American boycotts of British goods, lobbied furiously for repeal. By 1766, the Stamp Act was gone. But Parliament, unwilling to concede the principle, passed the Declaratory Act in the same breath, asserting its absolute right to legislate for the colonies in all matters. The match had been struck, even if the fire was not yet burning. Further taxes followed. Further resistance followed those. And then, in April 1775, on a muddy road outside the village of Lexington in Massachusetts, someone fired a shot that nobody ever claimed credit for. By nightfall, 73 British soldiers were dead. The war that many in London had assumed impossible had begun. Opinion in England was deeply, bitterly divided. Many ordinary English men and women felt genuine sympathy for the American cause. After all, these were people of English stock arguing for English liberties. Edmund Burke thundered in Parliament that the colonists were simply behaving as any freeborn Englishman would. Charles James Fox called the war a catastrophe of arrogance. Yet King George III and his Prime Minister, Lord North, pressed forward, convinced that firmness would restore order. For 6 grinding years, 2 civilizations that shared a language, a faith, and a legal tradition tried to destroy each other. The news arrived in London on the 25th of November, 1781. Lord North, reading the dispatch that described General Cornwallis's surrender at Yorktown, reportedly paced the room crying, "Oh God, it is all over." And so it was. An army of 8,000 British soldiers had laid down their arms to a combined American and French force in Virginia. The last serious hope of subduing the colonies had gone. The political fallout was swift and savage. Lord North's government collapsed within months. The Prime Minister who had pursued the war with the King's stubborn encouragement resigned in March 1782, weeping as he left office. Parliament, exhausted and humiliated, opened negotiations that produced the Treaty of Paris in 1783, formally recognizing the independence of 13 American states. For England, the loss cut in ways that went deeper than maps and ledgers. A foundational assumption of empire had been proved wrong. Subjects could not simply be governed from afar without consent, without representation, without some acknowledgement of their rights. The debate the war had sparked about taxation, liberty, and the nature of British power would not stay quietly in America. It would cross back over the Atlantic and find restless ears in England, in Ireland, and eventually in France, where a more violent reckoning was already beginning to take shape. The empire had not ended. Britain would go on to build something far larger than the 13 colonies it had lost. But it would do so carrying the hard-won knowledge that empires are not merely won by armies. They must somehow be justified by ideas. And in the coffee houses and drawing rooms of Georgian England, a new age of ideas was already beginning to stir. While Britain debated empire and liberty across the Atlantic, a quieter revolution was transforming the very ground beneath English feet. It happened not with cannon fire or declarations, but with ink on parchment, with surveyors' chains dragged across ancient meadows, and with the steady disappearance of a way of life that had endured for centuries. For generations, the English countryside had been organized around a system of open fields and common land. Villagers who owned little or nothing still possessed something precious: rights. The right to graze a cow on the common, to gather fuel from the heath, to cut hay from strips of shared meadow. These rights were not written in grand documents. They were written in custom, in memory, in the inherited understanding of communities that had worked the same soil since the medieval period. Parliament began to erase them. Between 1750 and 1850, roughly 4,000 individual enclosure acts reshaped approximately 6 million acres of English land. The process was almost absurdly simple from the perspective of the powerful. Wealthy landowners, who dominated Parliament entirely, would petition for an act covering a particular parish. Commissioners would arrive, survey the land, consolidate the scattered strips and commons into neat, hedged parcels, and assign them to those who could demonstrate formal legal ownership. The newly enclosed fields were more efficient, more productive, undeniably more rational by the emerging logic of agricultural capitalism. For the cottager with no deed, the process was simply dispossession. The losses were devastating in their particularity. A family that had kept 2 geese on the common and gathered wood from the heath suddenly found those habits criminalized. The cow that had supplemented a meager wage was gone. Children who had gleaned grain from harvested fields after the reapers passed through found the fields now fenced and private. Oliver Goldsmith, watching his native landscape transform, wrote mournfully in 1770 that the village itself seemed to be deserting its own ground. He was not wrong. It was. There were genuine agricultural gains. Enclosed farms allowed landowners to implement the new techniques championed by men like Jethro Tull and later Arthur Young. Crop rotation, selective breeding of livestock, improved drainage, all flourished under consolidated ownership. Grain yields climbed. English agriculture became the envy of Europe. The modernizing landlord who invested in his acres could point to real increases in production that helped feed a rapidly growing population. But productivity and human welfare are not the same thing. The rural poor paid the difference. Those displaced by enclosure faced stark choices. Some found work as hired laborers on the very land their families had once held rights to, earning wages that kept them perpetually one bad harvest from destitution. Others drifted toward the swelling towns of the Midlands and the North, where the mill owners and factory masters were hungry for exactly the kind of desperate, propertyless workforce that enclosure had created. The landless laboring class did not appear by accident. It was, in a very real sense, manufactured by an Act of Parliament. Unrest followed hardship. In southern England during the autumn of 1830, agricultural laborers rose in what became known as the Swing Riots, smashing threshing machines and burning herricks across more than 20 counties. The men who led these desperate protests signed their threatening letters with the name Captain Swing, a fictional avenger who existed nowhere except in the terrified imaginations of rural magistrates. The response from authorities was ferocious. Almost 2,000 men were tried. 19 were hanged. Nearly 500 were transported to Australia. What had been lost in the enclosure of England was not simply land. It was a principle that even the poorest member of a community held some stake in its commonwealth, some claim on the earth beneath them. That principle had been quietly repealed, field by hedged field, act by parliamentary act, across the better part of a century. The men and women displaced by those hedgerows would soon be crowding into the mills and foundries of a new industrial England. And understanding what drove them there means understanding the world they were about to build. They came into the towns already broken by the land. They arrived in Manchester and Birmingham and Leeds carrying almost nothing except the labor of their hands. And in the decades after 1760, something extraordinary was waiting for them. Not comfort, not dignity, not the life they had lost, but something that would, in time, reshape the entire world. It began with thread. For centuries, spinning and weaving had been the work of individual hands in individual cottages. A skilled spinner could produce only a single thread at a time, and cloth makers across England were perpetually hungry for more yarn than human fingers could supply. In 1764, a weaver and carpenter from Lancashire named James Hargreaves watched a spinning wheel fall on its side and continue turning. The spindle, now vertical, kept spinning. He wondered, what if you ran not one spindle but many? The result was the spinning jenny, a simple wooden frame that allowed a single worker to spin 8 threads simultaneously. Within a decade, improved versions ran 16, then 80. Richard Arkwright went further. His water frame, patented in 1769, harnessed river current to drive spinning machinery too large and powerful for any cottage. Arkwright built his first mill at Cromford in Derbyshire on the fast-flowing Derwent, and the template for industrial production was set. Workers did not bring work home anymore. They came to the machine, on the machine's schedule, under the machine's discipline. The factory was born. While the textile districts transformed the North, something equally momentous was happening underground and in the forge fires of Shropshire. Abraham Darby had discovered, early in the 1700s, that coke rather than charcoal could smelt iron efficiently. His ironworks at Coalbrookdale quietly ended England's dependence on shrinking forests and opened the age of cheap, abundant iron. By 1779, his grandson cast the world's first iron bridge across the River Severn at the same site. A single elegant arch of cast iron spanning 30 meters, an impossible-seeming structure that proved metal could do what wood and stone could not. But the machine that truly unlocked the age belonged to a Scottish instrument maker working in Glasgow. James Watt had been asked to repair a model of an earlier steam engine in 1763, and he found it breathtakingly inefficient. Within a decade of refinement, and with the crucial financial partnership of Birmingham manufacturer Matthew Boulton, Watt produced a rotary steam engine that could do continuous work. Power was no longer tied to a riverbank. A mill could now rise anywhere coal could be delivered. And coal could be delivered almost anywhere, because England was in the middle of building its canals. Between 1760 and 1810, roughly 4,000 miles of navigable waterway were cut across the English landscape. Canal mania gripped investors and engineers alike. The Bridgewater Canal opened in 1761 to carry coal from the Duke of Bridgewater's mines into Manchester, immediately halved the price of coal in the city. The lesson was unmistakable. Cheap bulk transport changed everything, for raw materials moving to factories and finished goods moving to markets. England's rivers were connected, its coalfields linked to its port cities, its interior opened for the first time to genuine commerce at scale. What did all of this mean for the men and women who actually worked these mills and foundries? It meant 14-hour days beside deafening machinery. It meant children as young as 6 threading bobbins in cotton mills where the air was thick with fiber. It meant wages set by the factory owner, time set by the factory clock, and dismissal for anyone who objected. The world being built in these smoky decades was one of staggering productive power and staggering human cost. Whole new cities were rising from fields and market towns. Social relations that had persisted for centuries were dissolving in the heat of the furnace. And as England industrialized with furious speed, those who governed it were beginning to realize that the old political arrangements, designed for a nation of landowners and merchants, might not survive the new one they were creating. What did it feel like to be small, and 5 years old and sent into the dark? For thousands of children in Georgian England, that question had a precise and terrible answer. The climbing boys, as they were called, were hired out to master chimney sweeps, Sometimes as young as 4 or 5 years old, their slight bodies forced up narrow brick flues still hot with ash. They climbed by pressing knees and elbows against the walls, skin raw and bleeding, breathing soot thick enough to choke. Many suffocated. Many developed chimney sweeps cancer, a scrotal cancer caused by soot exposure that became one of the first occupational cancers ever identified by medical science. Their masters sometimes lit straw beneath them to encourage speed. In the cotton mills spreading across Lancashire and Yorkshire, conditions were only marginally less brutal. Pauper apprentices, children taken from parish workhouses and bound by contract to factory owners, worked shifts of 12 to 14 hours, 6 days a week. They slept in dormitories beside the mills, several children to a bed, woken before dawn by overlookers who allowed no excuse for tardiness. Their task was often to crawl beneath moving machinery to retrieve fallen thread, darting between iron frames that could crush a limb without pausing. Accidents were common. Sympathy was rare. The coal mines consumed children differently. Boys as young as 5 or 6 were employed as trappers, sitting alone in total darkness for 10 hours at a stretch, operating ventilation doors to allow air to circulate through the tunnels. Older children hauled coal in carts on all fours through passages too low to stand. Women and girls worked alongside them until an 1842 parliamentary investigation, complete with drawings of the underground conditions, finally shocked public opinion into action. What did those towns look like above ground? Manchester's population had swelled from roughly 25,000 in 1772 to over 300,000 by 1850, a growth so violent that housing simply could not keep pace. Workers crowded into back-to-back terraces with no running water, shared privies serving dozens of families, and open sewers running between the rows. Typhus, cholera, and tuberculosis were not occasional visitors but permanent residents. In the industrial districts of Manchester in the 1830s, the average life expectancy for a laborer was just 17 years, compared to 38 for a rural gentleman farmer. The disparity was not a matter of fate. It was a matter of policy and neglect. Could Parliament simply look away? For decades, it largely did. The first significant response came with the Health and Morals of Apprentices Act of 1802, pushed through by the reforming mill owner Robert Owen and the elder Sir Robert Peel. It limited pauper apprentices to 12 hours of daily work and required some basic education. But it lacked any real mechanism for enforcement, and most owners ignored it entirely. More substantial reform came with the Factory Act of 1833, which prohibited children under 9 from working in textile mills and restricted those under 13 to 8 hours daily. Crucially, it created 4 paid factory inspectors, the first real attempt at industrial regulation in British history. It was imperfect, bitterly contested, and frequently evaded. But it established a principle that the state had both the right and the obligation to intervene in the relationship between employer and child. The machinery of empire that Britain was assembling rested on foundations of extraordinary suffering, much of it borne by those too young to resist or even to fully understand their own exploitation. How the nation chose to reckon with that suffering through politics, protest, and the slow expansion of democratic rights is where our story turns next. Across the English Channel in the summer of 1789, the world was being remade. When news reached London that a Parisian mob had stormed the Bastille fortress on the 14th of July, the reaction in Georgian England was immediate and deeply divided. Church bells rang in some dissenting chapels. Radical clubs raised glasses to the dawn of a new age. The poet William Wordsworth, then 19 years old, would later write that to be young in that moment was very heaven. For those who had long argued that power belonged to the people rather than to kings and aristocracies, France seemed to be proving it possible. But what felt like sunrise to the radicals looked like wildfire to the establishment. Edmund Burke, the Irish-born MP and political philosopher, watched events in Paris with growing dread. In November of 1790, he published Reflections on the Revolution in France, one of the most consequential political texts in the English language. Burke argued that society was not a contract to be torn up and rewritten by each generation, but a partnership between the dead, the living, and the unborn. The French, he warned, were not liberating themselves. They were destroying the accumulated wisdom of centuries in a single reckless act of abstraction. Within a year, his book had sold 30,000 copies and become the founding document of modern conservatism. The radical response came almost immediately. Thomas Paine, the Norfolk-born pamphleteer who had already helped ignite the American Revolution, published the first part of Rights of Man in February of 1791. Where Burke defended tradition, Paine dismantled it. Governments derive their authority from the people, he argued, not from inheritance or divine right. Every generation had the right to determine its own constitution. Hereditary monarchy was not merely impractical. It was an absurdity. Paine wrote not in the elevated language of philosophy, but in plain, blunt prose that any literate artisan could follow. Over 200,000 copies circulated in Britain in 2 years, an extraordinary number for the era, and reading clubs and corresponding societies in cities from London to Sheffield devoured every page. The government of William Pitt the Younger was watching, and growing frightened. As the revolution in France curdled into the terror, as the guillotine fell on the king in January of 1793 and war broke out between Britain and France, the political climate in England shifted sharply. Pitt's administration moved against the radical movement with increasing severity. In 1794, the government suspended habeas corpus, the ancient legal protection preventing imprisonment without trial, and arrested the leaders of the London Corresponding Society on charges of treason. The prosecutions ultimately failed, but the message was clear. Then came the Gagging Acts of 1795, 2 pieces of legislation that effectively criminalized large public meetings and extended the definition of treason to include spoken or written attacks on the Constitution. Radical publications were suppressed. Informers were planted in reform societies. The corresponding societies that had spread Paine's ideas from workshop to workshop were systematically dismantled. The debate ignited by the French Revolution did not end with repression, however. The questions Burke and Paine had thrown at each other across the pamphlet war about the source of authority, the rights of ordinary people, the limits of government power, would echo through the next 4 decades of British life. Every reform movement, every petition, every riot for bread or rights would carry the fingerprints of 1789. The age of deference was cracking. The question now was how long it could hold, and what would finally break it open. The war that Edmund Burke had feared and Thomas Paine had complicated arrived in February of 1793, when revolutionary France declared war on Britain. What few imagined on either side of the Channel was that the fighting would not stop for over 2 decades. An entire generation of Englishmen would grow up knowing nothing else. The threat felt genuinely existential. France, electrified by revolution and soon reorganized under the military genius of Napoleon Bonaparte, fielded the largest armies Europe had ever seen. Britain responded the only way it could, with money, with coalitions, and above all with the sea. It was the Royal Navy that stood between England and invasion. And at its heart stood one extraordinary man. Horatio Nelson, the slight, one-eyed son of a Norfolk clergyman, had transformed the rigid formalities of naval warfare into something electric and personal. On the 21st of October 1805, off Cape Trafalgar on the Spanish coast, Nelson's fleet engaged the combined French and Spanish Armada. He was killed by a French sharpshooter before the battle ended, but the victory was total. Over 20 enemy ships were captured or destroyed. Britain lost none. Napoleon would never again seriously threaten invasion, and the Royal Navy would dominate the world's oceans for a century to come. But Trafalgar was a distant spectacle. The war arrived in English life through quieter, crueler channels. The press gang was one of them. Parties of naval officers roamed coastal towns and seaports, legally entitled to seize any able-bodied man deemed suitable for service. A fisherman could be drinking in a tavern on a Tuesday and find himself on a warship bound for the Mediterranean by Thursday. Militias were raised inland, drilling on village greens, pulling farmers and craftsmen from their ordinary lives. By 1812, over 500,000 men were under arms in some capacity, an astonishing proportion of the male population. The costs fell on everyone. William Pitt introduced the first income tax in 1799, a wartime measure so shocking in concept that the government promised it would be abolished the moment peace returned. Prices for bread, coal, and candles climbed steadily as trade was disrupted and harvests failed. In 1800, grain shortages pushed the price of a loaf beyond the reach of laboring families, and food riots flared across the Midlands and the North. Women gathered outside bakeries. Magistrates read the Riot Act. The poor were being asked to bear a war they had no voice in starting. And yet the war also generated a peculiar, ferocious pride. Nelson's funeral in January of 1806 drew crowds of over 100,000 to the streets of London. Watercolors and engravings of Trafalgar hung in parlor windows. The enemy had a face now. Napoleon's and Britain gave it horns. The final act came in June of 1815, on a ridge south of Brussels. The Duke of Wellington, Arthur Wellesley, had spent years grinding through Portugal and Spain in a campaign of brutal attrition. Now he faced Napoleon himself. The Battle of Waterloo lasted a single long Sunday. French attacks broke repeatedly against Wellington's lines until the arrival of Prussian reinforcements sealed the defeat. Napoleon abdicated 4 days later and died in exile 6 years after that. Church bells rang across England. The newspapers declared it the greatest victory in the nation's history. But in the cottages and back streets, the mood was complicated. The men were coming home, and the taxes remained, and the bread was still expensive, and the work was not waiting. Victory had been won. What it would cost in peace, England was about to discover. While the cannons of Waterloo were still echoing across Europe, a quieter battle had already been fought on English soil for decades. One waged not with muskets and warships, but with pamphlets, petitions, and the persistent voices of ordinary people who believed that conscience could change the law. The transatlantic slave trade had made Britain extraordinarily wealthy. By the 1780s, British ships were transporting roughly 40,000 enslaved Africans each year across the Atlantic, feeding the sugar plantations of the Caribbean that sweetened English tea and filled the merchant accounts of Bristol and Liverpool. The human cost was almost incomprehensible. Millions of lives reduced to cargo. The first organized resistance came not from Parliament, but from the pews. The Quakers, long dissenters from the established order, formally condemned the slave trade in 1761 and began circulating printed arguments against it. They were joined by evangelical Christians, by freed black Africans living in London, and by campaigners like Granville Sharp and Thomas Clarkson, who gathered harrowing witness testimonies and distributed them across the country. By 1787, the Society for Effecting the Abolition of the Slave Trade had been founded, and something genuinely new was happening in English public life. Ordinary men and women were organizing around a moral cause that did not directly affect their own material interests. Women circulated petitions door to door. Households boycotted slave-grown sugar. More than 300,000 people signed abolition petitions, one of the largest popular campaigns the country had ever seen. In Parliament, they found their champion. William Wilberforce, the member for Yorkshire, was slight in frame but formidable in purpose. Beginning in 1789, he introduced abolition motions year after year, defeated each time by the combined weight of commercial interest, colonial lobbying, and the argument that wartime was no moment for economic disruption. He was met with claims that the trade was necessary, that it was humane compared to African alternatives, that British prosperity depended upon it. He pressed on regardless. The Abolition of the Slave Trade Act finally passed in March of 1807. It was a genuine triumph. British ships were now prohibited from transporting enslaved people, and the Royal Navy would eventually be tasked with enforcing the ban at sea. The crowd celebrated. Wilberforce wept in the Commons gallery. But abolitionists understood immediately what the act did not do. Slavery itself remained legal throughout British territories. Hundreds of thousands of enslaved people on Caribbean plantations continued in bondage. The campaign resumed. It would take another generation. By 1833, the new Reform Parliament, transformed by the electoral changes of the previous year, finally passed the Slavery Abolition Act. It came into effect in August of 1834. Wilberforce died just 3 days after learning the bill would pass, as if his purpose, finally complete, had released him. Yet the act carried a profound moral compromise. The British government paid £20 million in compensation, not to the formerly enslaved, but to the slaveholders. Enslaved people were required to serve a further period of so-called apprenticeship before full freedom was granted, a transition that would drag on until 1838. The formerly enslaved received nothing. It was liberation with a calculation attached, and the calculation told you everything about where power still resided in Georgian England. The abolition movement had demonstrated something remarkable nonetheless. That organized public conscience could reshape the law, that ordinary people possessed a moral authority that could outlast vested interests. It was a lesson the next generation would not forget, as a new England of factories, railways, and reform movements was already rising from the old. The soldiers who had fought Napoleon came home to find an England that could not feed them. The victory at Waterloo in 1815 should have ushered in a new age of prosperity. Instead, it delivered economic catastrophe. Wartime industries collapsed almost overnight. Demobilized soldiers and sailors, more than 300,000 of them, flooded a labor market that had no room for their return. Wages fell. Unemployment rose. And the harvests, cruelly, were poor. Parliament's response only deepened the wound. The Corn Laws of 1815, pushed through by a legislature dominated by landowners, placed heavy tariffs on imported grain to keep domestic prices artificially high. Bread, the basic staple of working life, became ruinously expensive. The men who made the law profited from it. The men who lived by their hands went hungry. The bitterness this produced was not merely political. It was visceral, the quiet fury of empty bellies and hungry children. Across the industrial North, a different kind of fury had already been expressing itself. The Luddite movement, which had erupted between 1811 and 1816, saw skilled textile workers systematically destroying the new mechanized frames that they believed were stealing their livelihoods. These were not ignorant men raging at progress. They were craftsmen defending a way of life, organized enough to operate at night, disciplined enough to strike specific targets. The government answered with soldiers and legislation, making machine breaking a capital offense. 17 men were hanged at York in 1813. The movement was crushed, but the grievance that had produced it remained very much alive. By 1819, radical reformers were holding mass meetings across England, calling for parliamentary representation for the new industrial cities of Manchester, Birmingham, and Leeds, places of enormous population and precisely 0 seats in Parliament. On the 16th of August, 60,000 people gathered peacefully at St. Peter's Field in Manchester to hear the orator Henry Hunt speak on parliamentary reform. They came in their Sunday clothes, many of them. They brought their children. What happened next appalled the nation. Local magistrates, panicking at the size of the crowd, ordered cavalry to charge into it with sabers drawn. 18 people were killed. Hundreds more were injured, many of them women and children. Someone gave it a name with savage irony: Peterloo. The government, rather than investigating the carnage, praised the magistrates and rushed through the 6 acts, a package of legislation designed to suppress radical meetings and silence the press. To those calling for reform, the message was unmistakable. The ruling order intended to offer no concessions. The Cato Street Conspiracy of 1820 briefly gave those in power an opportunity to paint all radicals as violent revolutionaries. A small group of extremists, led by Arthur Thistlewood, plotted to assassinate the entire cabinet at dinner and spark an uprising. They were infiltrated, arrested, and 5 were hanged. The government deployed the episode to discredit moderate reformers by association, though the conspiracy revealed desperation, not the organized revolutionary threat ministers claimed. In the countryside, a different desperation simmered. The Swing Riots of 1830 swept through the agricultural counties of southern England as farm laborers, facing mechanized threshing machines that threatened their winter employment, burned haystacks and smashed machinery across the rural South. The name Captain Swing appeared in threatening letters sent to landlords and farmers. It was the countryside's own Peterloo moment, raw and anguished. England in these years was a nation straining against itself. The pressure for change was becoming irresistible, and the question of how that change would arrive, by reform or by rupture, would soon demand an answer that Parliament could no longer avoid. What did it mean to be a woman in Georgian England? In law, the answer was painfully simple. Upon marriage, a woman ceased to exist as an independent legal person. The doctrine of coverture, inherited from centuries of common law, merged a wife's legal identity entirely into her husband's. She could not own property, sign contracts, keep her own wages, or retain custody of her children should the marriage fail. Whatever she brought to the marriage, her money, her land, her inheritance, became his the moment vows were exchanged. For women of the aristocracy and gentry, this legal invisibility existed alongside considerable practical influence. Managing a great country house was a serious undertaking. Supervising dozens of servants, overseeing household accounts, organizing the social calendar that oiled the machinery of political and commercial life, these were genuine responsibilities requiring intelligence and discipline. Ladies like Georgiana, Duchess of Devonshire, wielded social power that few men could match, even while remaining legally subordinate to their husbands. Below stairs and beyond the estate gates, the picture looked entirely different. Working women across Georgian England labored in textile mills, laundries, fields, and the homes of the prosperous. Domestic service employed more women than any other occupation, placing young girls as young as 12 into households where their hours were unlimited and their protections essentially non-existent. In the expanding textile factories of the North, women and children formed the bulk of the workforce, paid wages a fraction of what men received for equivalent labor. In agriculture, women worked alongside men through planting and harvest seasons, their contributions vital yet economically invisible. Courtship and marriage were matters of enormous consequence across every social rank. For wealthy families, marriage was a negotiation between dynasties, a transfer of property and alliance managed by fathers and solicitors. For laboring women, it was often the difference between bare subsistence and desperate poverty, a calculation of survival rather than romance. Widowhood without resources could mean the workhouse. Into this landscape came Mary Wollstonecraft. Published in 1792, her Vindication of the Rights of Woman struck many contemporaries as scandalous and others as revelatory. Wollstonecraft argued with fierce clarity that women were not naturally inferior to men, but had been deliberately kept ignorant through deficient education. She demanded that women be treated as rational beings, educated accordingly, and granted the agency their humanity required. She was mocked, dismissed, and after her death in 1897, used as a cautionary tale by those who wished to silence her ideas. Yet her words did not disappear. They circulated quietly, read by women who recognized in them something that named their own experience. The lives of Georgian women were defined by constraint. But within those constraints, women managed businesses, raised families, ran farms, wrote novels, argued philosophy, and occasionally, quietly, refused. That resilience would carry forward into the century ahead, where the questions Wollstonecraft raised would eventually demand answers no government could indefinitely deny. If law defined the lives of Georgian women, faith defined the lives of nearly everyone. In parish churches scattered across every county, the Church of England performed the essential rituals of existence: baptisms, marriages, burials, marking the passage of life from cradle to grave. The local vicar was often the most educated man in a village, the keeper of records, the arbiter of charity, the voice of moral authority. For most Georgians, the established church was not merely a religious institution. It was the architecture of community itself. Yet the church had grown comfortable with its own authority. By the early 18th century, critics complained that too many clergymen were more interested in their livings than their flocks. Sermons could be lifeless. The poor, crowded into the cheaper pews or excluded entirely by the cost of renting one, sometimes felt that the Church of England served the prosperous rather than the suffering. Into this spiritual vacuum stepped John Wesley. An Oxford-educated clergyman himself, Wesley underwent a transformative religious experience in May of 1738, feeling his heart, as he famously described it, strangely warmed. What followed was one of the most remarkable personal campaigns in English religious history. For more than 50 years, Wesley traveled an estimated 250,000 miles on horseback, preaching to crowds of thousands in open fields and town squares, reaching miners in Cornwall, mill workers in Yorkshire, and the urban poor whom the established church had barely touched. His message was urgent, democratic, and emotionally powerful. Salvation was available to all. Every soul mattered. The movement Wesley ignited, Methodism, spread with extraordinary speed. By the time of his death in 1791, he had attracted over 70,000 followers in Britain alone. Methodism offered something the established church often failed to provide: a sense of genuine belonging, lay participation, and spiritual intensity that transformed how ordinary people understood their faith and their place in the world. Beyond Methodism, religious dissent took many forms across Georgian England. Quakers, Baptists, Congregationalists, and Unitarians had maintained communities since the previous century, but their civic lives remained restricted. The Test and Corporation Acts barred non-Anglicans from holding public office, a legal exclusion that reformers campaigned against for decades. Nowhere was the question of religious equality more charged than in the long struggle for Catholic emancipation. In a nation where Catholicism had been associated for generations with foreign tyranny and political treachery, granting Catholics full civil rights was deeply controversial. The debate convulsed Parliament and spilled into the streets. Finally, in 1829, the Roman Catholic Relief Act passed, allowing Catholics to sit in Parliament and hold most public offices for the first time in over a century. It was a seismic moment, a signal that England's Protestant establishment, however dominant, could no longer claim absolute authority over the spiritual and civic lives of all its people. That expanding sense of individual conscience would shape the reforms still to come. By the 1820s, England's political system was a monument to its own contradictions. A nation that prided itself on liberty and constitutional order still elected its parliament through a structure so warped, so riddled with privilege and absurdity, that even many of its defenders struggled to justify it with a straight face. The problem had a name that said everything: rotten boroughs. These were constituencies where the electorate had dwindled to almost nothing over the centuries, yet still sent members to Parliament. Old Sarum in Wiltshire was perhaps the most notorious example. A grassy hillside with no permanent residents, it returned 2 members of Parliament, controlled entirely by a single landowner who effectively purchased the seats. Meanwhile, the booming industrial cities of Manchester, Birmingham, and Leeds, each home to tens of thousands of workers and merchants, sent no one to Westminster at all. The system had not kept pace with a country transformed by industry, migration, and empire. It had simply calcified. Who could actually vote? In England's county constituencies, the franchise rested with men owning freehold property worth at least 40 shillings a year, a threshold unchanged since 1430. In borough constituencies, The rules varied wildly from town to town. In some places, almost any male resident could vote. In others, the electorate amounted to a handful of men, their votes bought openly with cash or favors. Bribery was not a scandal. It was a custom. The pressure for change had been building for decades, but the crisis that finally broke the dam arrived in 1830. A wave of political upheaval was sweeping Europe. In France, revolution had toppled the Bourbon monarchy for the second time. In England, economic hardship gripped the countryside, and a new working-class consciousness, sharpened by years of industrial labor and radical journalism, demanded a voice. When the Whig government under Prime Minister Earl Grey introduced a reform bill in 1831, the response was electric. What followed was nearly 2 years of extraordinary political drama. The bill passed the House of Commons, only to be thrown out by the House of Lords. Riots broke out in Bristol, Nottingham, and Derby. Middle-class reformers formed political unions across the country, coordinating peaceful mass demonstrations that drew crowds of startling size. There were genuine fears among the aristocracy that England stood on the edge of revolution. The question was not simply whether the bill would pass. It was whether Parliament itself could survive the crisis of its own legitimacy. It survived, barely. King William IV threatened to flood the House of Lords with newly created Whig peers if it continued to resist. Faced with that prospect, enough lords stepped aside to allow the Great Reform Act to pass in June of 1832. The results were significant, but carefully bounded. The rotten boroughs were swept away. 56 of them lost their seats entirely, and the representation was redistributed to the industrial towns so long ignored. The electorate expanded from roughly 435,000 voters to around 650,000, an increase of nearly 50%. It was real, measurable change. And yet, women remained entirely excluded. Working-class men were still shut out. The new property qualifications still kept the franchise firmly in the hands of the middle classes and the propertied. The Reform Act was not democracy. It was a concession designed, at least in part, to prevent democracy. But the principle it established could not be contained. If Parliament could be reformed once, it could be reformed again. The crack in the door would not close. On the 26th of June, 1837, King William IV drew his final breath at Windsor Castle. He was 71 years old, a bluff, well-meaning sailor king who had never quite seemed comfortable with the crown. Within hours, a small delegation made its way to Kensington Palace, where an 18-year-old girl was roused from sleep to be told that she was now Queen of England. Victoria received the news alone. No mother hovering at her shoulder, no advisor speaking for her. She was small, composed, and absolutely certain of herself. Those who witnessed the moment noted something steely beneath the youth. A new era had announced itself quietly in a candlelit room before dawn. But what kind of England did she inherit? By 1837, the country was home to approximately 14 million people in England and Wales alone, nearly double the figure from the beginning of the Georgian period. London had become the largest city on earth, a sprawling, fog-choked metropolis of over 1.5 million souls. The cotton mills of Lancashire ran through the night. The ironworks of the Black Country glowed against the darkness like something out of Scripture. England was the workshop of the world, though most of those doing the actual work had yet to see meaningful reward for it. And then there were the railways. In 1837, roughly 1,000 miles of track had already been laid across England. Within a decade, that figure would quadruple. The steam locomotive had done something profound. It had collapsed distance, knitted the nation together, and made the old rhythms of Georgian life feel almost quaint by comparison. The mail coach, the turnpike, the inn-yard bustling with horses, all of it was passing away with startling speed. The Georgians had built the foundations beneath Victoria's feet. Their architects had given England its terraced squares, its graceful crescents, its grand civic buildings in Bath and Edinburgh and London. Their jurists had wrestled the common law into something approaching coherence. Their thinkers had planted the seeds of abolitionism, political economy, and scientific inquiry that would flower in the century ahead. Over 123 years, England had fought Napoleon and buried him, industrialized its landscape beyond recognition, traded across every ocean, reformed its parliament, and abolished slavery throughout its empire. It had done all of this without revolution, which was perhaps its most remarkable achievement of all, and perhaps its most revealing one. The Georgian era was not a golden age. It was loud, unequal, and often brutal. But it was transformative in ways its inhabitants could barely comprehend while living through them. Victoria would reign for 63 years. She would preside over an empire that covered a quarter of the Earth's surface. But the engine that drove that empire, the laws, the trade, the restless industrial energy, had been built in Georgian England. The young queen simply inherited what a turbulent century had made. Georgian England forged the foundations of the modern world, leaving behind a legacy of empire, industry, and relentless human perseverance that still echoes today. Subscribe for more journeys through the moments that shaped history.